Welcome to a special presentation from Night of the Living podcast, Zoned Out, revisiting the Twilight Zone. I'm here with my good buddy Joe, and we're about to dig into the Twilight Zone series. We were talking, and you had suggested this. Have you ever wanted to do a Twilight Zone podcast? And I'm like, of course I have. It's my favorite show of all time. I just never.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's hard. To do it alone would have sucked. So to do it with you is really fun. I'm glad you suggested it.
Right on. Likewise.
So the Twilight Zone, I'm sure you probably already know quite a bit about it. If you're listening to a podcast, you're probably already a fan. But just in case you're not, this was an anthology series that was on CBS in the late 50s, written and created by Rod Serling, and tons of episodes, 5 seasons, I believe, of the original series, I want to say.
Yeah.
The who's who of sci-fi and fantasy writers kind of would pop up through here. Everybody from Richard Matheson to Ray Bradbury, Rod Serling himself. But just a really awesome series that there are other podcasts about it, but this one's ours. And
right on.
I think we bring a different perspective. I think we're older than a lot of the guys that do this podcasting about TV stuff, right?
Experienced. Yeah, we're more experienced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how were you introduced to the Twilight Zone, Joe?
It's funny. When I was a kid, this was one of those shows that was always reruns on the network television stations. So, I'd be up Saturday, and if it wasn't cartoons I was watching old episodes of Twilight Zone. My parents were big into sci-fi and stuff, not like hardcore geekery like we are now and have the ability to now, but for their times they were kind of, I like creepy stuff,
Yeah.
So they would be watching different episodes, and occasionally they'd make reference to a show, like when we're doing something day to day. So it's kind of cool to see them tie in the lessons of the show, which is something that I really took away strongly as a lot of the impressions I got from the stories themselves.
There's so much to be learned. Yeah. Rod Serling, there was a lot of advocacy hidden in his work. Sometimes not so hidden, but a lot of times, especially in later seasons of Twilight Zone, when the network pressures came, he kind of had to start getting a little more clever about putting those messages under a veil, so they wouldn't get hate mail from the dumbasses that didn't really understand what he was trying to do. I'm not judging you if you didn't like the Twilight Zone, but there was a lot of pushback against him because of some of the ideas he was putting up on TV in the 50s, especially. If you think about it, that's like considered a pretty stodgy time.
Well, and it's really subversive for that time too. You found a way to put in a lot of messages that people didn't internalize, or they internalized, but they didn't realize they were getting that until later,
Well, I haven't even said I'm Freddy. I don't think I've said that, but I also came to the Twilight Zone through my parents, my dad in particular. And we would argue about what was better, the Outer Limits or Twilight Zone. And I'm like, you're crazy if you think Outer Limits is anywhere near as good as Twilight Zone. But I've revisited that show as well. It's just, you can see the difference. There's something about the tight storytelling on Twilight Zone is what I think made it the best, is that there's no lollygagging. These episodes are 23, 24 minutes long, with some exceptions throughout the run of the show. But a small amount of time to get a big point across, usually with a twist, almost always a twist. And it's just a wonderful series. But we're kicking it off right with the very first episode called Where Is Everybody? Now, this episode originally appeared on October 2nd, 1959. It was a Friday, and I think it stayed on as a Friday night show. I'm not sure if it was for its entire run, but we'll figure that out as we go. The backstory on this, I thought this was interesting, and a lot of people don't know this, but I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Rod Serling actually got the big first break to his career came through our local channel. Well, it was Channel 12, but it's WKRC, which is an affiliate of, I can't remember, I think CBS. And he wrote a show on that local station that was called, and now do you remember the name of it? I just lost it in my notes.
The Storm.
The Storm, thank you. So The Storm was a live format show. So basically they would perform a little play and film it in the TV studio, and it would go out, live to an audience, and then it was taped. It was back in the day when they had these ads that would open most programs. Everything was sponsored by something right at the beginning and the end. And this one was Kamei, soap for beautiful women.
And the patriarchy is heavy in this. Man, they lay it on thick.
It really is, big time. And on top of that, it's a war story, even with all male characters.
Right, and they're all doing those voices of it's funny. You can see in this kind of that transition from the old radio shows where they did everything live on the audio to being in a spot where it's like, well, they're still performing it live, because I kept thinking, God, it'd be nerve-wracking to broadcast this live. Well, they're all used to it,
Yeah.
That's what they came up in. And so taping it would have been like, oh, I guess we can edit that later, but they couldn't get lazy with it. They had to do everything in that first take. And so they were just used to it. But yeah, it's wild.
So much like the theater. And the sets are also, because you don't have the advantage of having these elaborate set changes. Like this first one, did you watch both parts of it too?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, it's very like the protoplasm of of Rod Serling. It's not refined yet. It's a lot of the monologuing that he is famous for, without all of the conflict that you would expect. And given it is a war scene, the conflict's built in, but it kind of is just like this plotting production that's all in this darkened stage, and it's a lot about the nature of war. You can tell he's not matured as a writer yet. This was in 1951, so we had another 7 years before he started working on the Twilight Zone. But in between The Storm and the beginning of the Twilight Zone, there was a series called Playhouse 90, which was another CBS show, and he wrote the second episode of that series. There were 134 of these. There's an anthology show, so every episode you were getting a different story. It was like a little movie of the week almost. And he wrote one called Requiem for a Heavyweight, which was a huge success and really put him on the map. And because he got so much attention from that, CBS gave him the Twilight Zone. And that brings us back to Where Is Everybody? Did I do okay?
Yeah, it was great. And Requiem for a Heavyweight, if I'm not mistaken, that's an episode later too. Like they made that into a Twilight Zone episode?
They made it into a movie, and then he did a boxing episode of the Twilight Zone, but I can't remember for sure. He did maybe more than one boxing, because there's the one with the robot too. With Lee Marvin.
I feel bad. I don't want to spoil things, but it's like, this show's been out for quite a while. So,
yeah, that's right. I can't remember if he did this as part of Twilight Zone Requiem, because Requiem for a Heavyweight is a more straight drama than the Twilight Zone material, but I don't know. I know it became a feature film with Tony Quinn, I want to say, in the 60s.
Okay.
And I haven't seen it in forever, because I was such a big Rod Serling fan. I had tracked down the old episode of the old show, but it's been forever since I've seen that.
Yeah.
But I remember it being really great, and it shows the difference between what you get with The Storm versus Requiem for a Heavyweight is night and day. It's like anybody who writes stories, if you ever discouraged about something you wrote, look at The Storm. You can find it on YouTube, and compare it to Requiem for a Heavyweight, and you can see in 7 years how much somebody's writing can be refined, beyond your imagination, I think. Just like a different person almost.
Well, it's wild to see the progress of I've always seen the Twilight Zone as the finished product, right? And I always thought of Rod Serling as this amazing creator, and it's like, well, yeah, everybody comes up though, and to look at those earlier steps to see, just like you said, it's the progress, and it's the process of learning your craft. And I love how each one of these projects, you can see little elements of oh, okay, I can see where they took the storytelling and they formatted it like this. They added these pieces. You can tell in the difference between that live recorded piece in The Storm and the taped Twilight Zone episodes, clearly they were to put a lot more refinement on it, and the camera angles, which we'll get into in a bit. Just a lot of really cool techniques and stuff they use there.
Yeah, and most of the Twilight Zone was shot on film as well, not video. So it looks great out of the gate. Where is everybody? They went to Universal. The back lot that you'll recognize from Back to the Future is what I always think of when I see that lot.
Right.
I know it's used for a bunch of things, but like every time, the first thing I think is Save the Clock Tower, and her raising money to save the clock tower. But it opens on our main character who doesn't know who he is. He has a kind of amnesia, wandering around that backlot set, and it's completely abandoned. And you think maybe everyone's been obliterated in a war or something, but you have just this one guy through the episode just features one character for a majority of the 23 minutes. Not until like the last 3 minutes do you get introduced to the other 9 cast members, which for your first episode of a series, I know this isn't the first one he wrote for the series, but for them, I have a feeling they probably, and I can't verify this, I didn't find anything to support this, but I feel like they must have just felt this one was so strong to take that risk, because I think you are really asking a lot of somebody to kind of watch a guy wander around for 20 minutes for your pilot, you know?
Right. Yeah. In reading some of the notes on it, Serling apparently didn't like the fact that he kind of had to monologue to the camera, as he's talking out loud to nobody, to get through some of the pieces of it, to do the exposition, which, like you said, you can see later on where that gets stronger and he finds different techniques. But I think it's one of those where you look at your earlier work and you go, oh, I could have done that better. You know?
All the mirror talking doesn't really do it for me either, but like, it doesn't matter. Like, I'll get to that actually. Before I get into the meat of the episode, I wanted to say, you get that great Rod Serling intro where he is doing the monologue everybody knows and loves, but he wasn't the original choice. In fact, like, they just settled on him doing it because they said this guy, and I have the audio for this, was sounded too pompous in the original pilot intro that they made for the show. His name was Van Voris. I can't remember his first name, but he was the original announcer, and they even wanted to get Orson Welles at one point to do this, but he was too expensive, which makes sense. But here is what the original intro sounded like from the 1959 pilot.
There is a sixth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the sunlight of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area that might be called the Twilight Zone.
He doesn't really commit either. He's like, it might be called the Twilight Zone.
It might be. I'm not quite sure. You'll have to. I'm going to check my notes. Yeah. And it's funny. You can hear the stodginess in it because Rod Serling, now that he's iconically associated with it, he's got such an interesting cadence to his voice. Even when he's doing the intros, just that intro, but like every episode, he's got the da-da-da-da. You can hear his inflection and all the texture he adds to what he's saying.
And all the cigarettes that refined his vocal cords.
Right, exactly. Well, and I was reading some of the notes too. They said that they only knew him as a writer, and so they didn't really even think of him as possibly doing it till he did it, and then they were like, yeah, that works. You know?
I mean, people use his voice in cartoons and stuff. Like, there'll be actors when they want to do an announcer voice for anything kind of surreal or strange. It's usually a Rod Serling impersonation, you know? So like, and that makes me wonder too, like kids who didn't grow up with the Twilight Zone, who watched cartoons, might not even realize, like a lot. And it's true also, not only of Rod Serling, but like characters of this era, these voice actors and cartoon creators grew up watching the Twilight Zone and old movies with Peter Lorre. That's why you hear Peter Lorre's voice coming out of cartoon characters and stuff. The impersonations of these, fantasy and sci-fi and horror stuff has a major impact, I think, on the creative fields. The little tidbits that they pull out, whether those people are creating things in that same genre or not, like it pops up everywhere.
Right on. It's like the one that I keep thinking of more recently was the Animaniacs.
Oh yeah,
which it's Steven Spielberg, but it throws back, and they use a lot of those character voices of where people go like, "Where's that from?" And more modern influences. I mean, it's still an old show now, but
yeah.
But like you said, Peter Lorre, you look at the old Bugs Bunny cartoons and you see all those characters and you're like, who are these people? And then you see the movies of the time, the 40s, and you're like, oh, that's, Peter Lorre, like you said, that's Benny Goodman, that's all these different characters. It's funny, I sat in the Jackbox games too. There's one of the Jackbox games is kind of this oddball one, and the narrator has the Rod Serling voice and wears the suit, but it's a cat.
Oh yeah, I've played that. I can't remember which one that is, but yeah, I love that. It just things like you said, it pops up. It shows how timeless it is. If you can't, and God, I hope they never take this out of Disney World, but the Tower of Terror, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror is so fantastic. If you're a theme park person, which I'm less of these days, but I love that attraction so much. And if they ever rebrand it, I'll curl up in a ball and cry. But it's so special for a fan of the Twilight Zone to go through. Have you ever ridden that?
No, in fact, I only went to Disney. What was it? Disney, is Disneyland the original?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, they had Tower of Terror there too for a long time, but they rebranded.
Okay.
It. Yeah.
Okay, I think I went to the one in Florida, whatever that one is.
Yeah.
World. And yeah. So World. Okay. So I went to World, and I went there with just a little kid who was only 5. It was my girlfriend's son and her and my girlfriend and my girlfriend's mom. And we went to all the really like little kid stuff. So it's the first time I've ever been to a Disney park. And, I've been to local parks and some Cedar Point stuff, and Universal's what I brought most of my family to. But this is my first time at Disney, and we did the Pirates of the Caribbean thing where it's like the old animatronics. And I was like,
oh yeah.
Wow,
it's
this
amazing.
Is like, yeah.
Well,
when you think back,
I'm sorry.
It was time, right? No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, you think about those animatronics and the level of artistry. Just imagine a ride that is you go into a old hotel. It's based on the Roosevelt Hotel in L.A. And once you walk in, you're hearing like old music from the era of the Twilight Zone. And you get into the lobby and it's just dusty, but there's artifacts from all the episodes throughout the attraction. And then you get in an elevator and, that's the ride, you get dropped. But everything around it, for a Twilight Zone fan, it is really a special thing. Like the dummies there, Talkie Tina, like all that stuff is planted throughout the attraction.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I've never been to Universal myself. I really do want to go one of these days. We should work it out.
Do a separate podcast on that, on amusement park attractions and such.
Do a podcast about everything.
Right, yeah. Split the Room is that Jackbox game. It's part of Pack 5.
Oh, yeah. That is fun. So I just pulled up like an on this day, like to frame what was going on in the world the day that Where Is Everybody premiered. It was Friday. This was 65 years ago. This is the baby boomer generation. The Chinese zodiac was pig, and the star sign was Libra. The number one song in the U.S. was Bobby Darin's "Mac the Knife." In the U.K., it was "Only 16" by Craig Douglas. Plan 9 from Outer Space was out. Was considered to be the worst movie of all time. There's The Far Side of the Moon was revealed. I mean, this is like kind of where we're at, and the Far Side of the Moon kind of being revealed during this time. And what I mean is they took a photograph of it. The Soviets did. It really makes a lot of sense as to what was on everybody's mind and why ultimately the end of this episode was probably pretty profound for the original audience. I mean, it's still pretty great twist at the end, and we'll get to that. But
yeah.
Like we said, it's mostly one character, but it's Robert Stevens directed this. He directed 44 episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which if you've never seen is awesome. If you're an anthology series fan, it's a lot like the Twilight Zone, only it's not supernatural. It's mostly murder mysteries and thrillers. But this director did 2 Twilight Zone episodes. He did this one and one called Walking Distance, which is also excellent, which is episode 5 of this first season. So we'll get to that too. So there's all of these moments of, like we were saying, him just kind of talking to himself in the mirror and trying to figure out who he is and why he's there and why nobody else is there. He's got $1.58 or something, and he's like, "I'm hungry and I got money."
Yeah, hungry customer. He almost has this weird Brando-like accent. I don't know if that's because he's from, I think the actor's from Louisiana, but yeah, Earl Holliman.
So he's what they call him, slack-jawed is the way he was described on IMDb in his little bio. Oh, yeah. They're like slack-jawed actor. His character is kind of like got this crazy entitled air about him, even though it looks like he's in a bombed out. For all you know, everyone on Earth is dead, and he's just indignant about not getting service.
Well, it was funny. I watched it with my youngest kid, and he's so aggressive with his, the way he's talking. "Hey, hungry customer!" And he's like jumping over counters and stuff.
Yeah, he's yelling an order. Funny. He's like, "Eggs, toast."
But he's looking through the books and stuff at one point, and he sees a book, Last Man on Earth, which again I think he's planting the seed of like, oh, it's kind of that red herring of what is this?
It's just another Twilight Zone writer too. The Last Man on Earth is the alternate title for I Am Legend, the Richard Matheson book. Oh. So they put those on that spinner because at that time Serling already knew Matheson. And that was one of the titles for that work. But definitely the Last Man on Earth thing makes it extra dreamy. That whole rack is that book.
Yeah,
they're making sure you don't miss it.
I won't jump in too far into this, but later on he hits the movie theater, and actually you see it right at the beginning too when he hits the city. And the movie playing is called Battle Hymn, and I was like, oh, it's probably some made up thing. No, Battle Hymn was a movie starring Rock Hudson and Martha Hyer. And that was, I think it was 50. No, wait, let's see. When was that? I have a note on it somewhere here. 1957. And that was a real movie. And it's funny that there's a little thing for it, but all that stuff was real for the time when this episode is coming out. So it tied into a lot of contemporary media stuff, like you said, with the book and the movie, and some of the actors on this ended up in a movie together later on called The Sons of Kate Elder with I think it was John Wayne and Dean Martin. But it's just seeing all the connections. That was in 65 that they became known for. But yeah, it's all actual stuff. I love all the little what do we call those
Easter eggs, maybe
Easter eggs. Thank you. Yes, that's what I was looking for.
It makes it feel like it's not. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. The show, like you're saying, these are real movie, real book. So it's not a complete and different world that he's landed on. So it's not like it's a place that looks like Earth because he's watching an Earth movie and there's an Earth book. So it's kind of, in a way, some of those things are kind of like grounding. The music is Bernard Herrmann, which, later would, do Psycho and every other, tons of Hitchcock, and awesome composer. But Herrmann scored 68 of the Twilight Zone episodes. So sorry, I was just looking at my notes here. So I was trying to remember.
Herrmann. It's weird to think of like how many of these people went on to become such huge creative stars too, but this was the launching ground with so many actors and different composers, like you said, and writers, that it really was a kind of a farm team for all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's kind of like the television equivalent of like Weird Tales magazine or something, where all these people were coming up on something that it became prestigious, but in the beginning, this was a risk, kind of like you had Requiem for a Heavyweight, so he had proven himself as a writer, but also you had a show that was selling itself on supernatural stuff and weird twists, but they create an episode that is a plausible, realistic situation for their pilot.
Yeah.
Which I guess we can get into, like, he has wandered around, can't find anybody, ends up in that movie you were describing. When finally he's brought out of this fantasy that his brain has created, and he's really in a 5x5 box, which sounds awful, in the middle of this hangar, and he's being observed by 9 men, and one of them is an Army or an Air Force general.
And there's the Easter egg, or the piece where he figures out that he's a general, or he figures out that he's in the Air Force based on looking at the poster and looking at like his jumpsuit. And going,
yeah.
Oh, I'm in the Air Force. I'm Air Force. And he goes into the movie and
he's screaming, I'm in the Air Force.
Right.
Give me eggs and coffee. I'm in the Air Force.
I demand respect. I'm in the Air Force.
I drive a Dodge Stratus. They should remake this episode with Will Ferrell in that role. It'd be amazing.
Yeah. Oh, I want to call back to one other moment that always sticks with me, and that is when he's looking around, he sees a woman in a truck, and he starts talking to her, like yelling across the street, and he goes over there and opens the door, and they intentionally block it. So a lot of the film or camera work for this is just so good. They intentionally block until he goes right up next to her, he opens the door, and she falls out. It's a mannequin. And then he keeps talking to her. And it's, again, you can see where this does not age super well. He's like, hey, doll, I like the silent type. And it's like, oh, that's creepy. That's no.
I actually made a note too about that scene. I think I said, is he going to fuck that doll or that mannequin? Yeah. Cause I was just like, you're so right about, it's just weird.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's one of those things that they did in I Am Legend too, which is ironic because if you watch the Will Smith version of I Am Legend, like, he kind of talks to mannequins too in that. And I no doubt that that's kind of part from this. But the mannequins, there's all kinds of mannequins in this to give you that unsettling feeling of like there's still human figures all around him, but they're not living. It makes it extra weird.
Right.
But yeah, he wakes up after his revelation that he is in the Air Force. His name is Mike Ferris. The Air Force general, as they're wheeling him out and they're explaining that he is an astronaut who's going to the moon. And this was all to prepare him psychologically for the isolation he was going to experience. And it actually ends on a surprisingly kind of optimistic tone for the character. You think he would be like, I don't ever want to do this because I've gone crazy during it. But he's like, okay, now I'm ready to do it for real. Now that I've gone through this crazy hell, shoot me into the moon, baby. Let's get on that rocket and go. But he's still kind of sweaty and out of it on a gurney. But you feel like he's ready to just get strapped in and go the next day, maybe.
I was curious too with the general's comments if like they're like, hey, cracked, and he didn't seem like happy about it. Like, I wonder if that was some false optimism on the part of the guy who was the Air Force, Mike Ferris, that he was thinking, oh, I'm still coming to the moon, and the general's like, no, you didn't make it. But he was in there, they said, for 484 hours and 36 minutes. So that's like 20 some days, almost 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think it was like because that was a guesstimate in the best idea Rod Serling had of the science was. They were like, oh, how long would it take to get to the moon? And they came up with like 3 weeks is what they settled on as a guess. So that's why he was in there that amount of time. I clipped out some dialogue from the general that kind of summarizes like why this technically this probably was a failure in preparing this guy, but I'll just read it real quick. It's a few sentences. You see, we can feed the stomach with concentrates. We can supply microfilm for reading, recreation, even movies of a sort. We can pump oxygen in and waste material out, but there's one thing we can't simulate. That's a very basic need. Man's hunger for companionship, the barrier of loneliness. That's one thing we haven't licked yet. And I thought, this kind of throws back to the monologuing that Serling never totally abandons in his writing, but it's a little more concise in this than compared to The Storm. Like there would be like 3 or 4 monologues like this in The Storm.
Right, right. It's like they cut right into it, and then he even in the step after that, as he's doing his exit monologue, he does the up there is an enemy unknown as or an enemy known as isolation. You know, he re-emphasizes it, but it's clear. It's funny. The first thing I thought when they said that was, oh well, now they would just have an AI character that you would talk to, and you know that's the weird modern take on that is we might actually have something now, you know.
But in most stories, I feel like you'd still be compelled to make the AI not be quite human, and it would malfunction and make things worse. You know, in real life, we have AI that might actually help somebody get through that. But if you're telling that story, that AI has to become Hal from 2001, you know?
Right. Well, and you can see the influence on later series like something like Black Mirror, where they do that, where it's focused on the tech aspects of modern society that go awry, and that's perfectly, you know, it's a great example of how they could take an initial Twilight Zone idea and then go, okay, here's where it goes bad.
Yeah, and where the tech is the problem.
Right, exactly.
Twilight Zone is the tech just isn't there yet. Black Mirror is we built the tech and now it's not what we wanted. You know, it's amazing the perspective shift, you know.
The unintended consequences of what we, you know, here's the good things we expected, but then this also happened, and all the drawbacks.
This episode's a good one, but it's like it's not a favorite of mine, you know, but I enjoy it, but it's missing that little something that the supernatural thing, or even not just something O. Henry like. And I know I was reading the original ending that he reached into his flight suit pocket and pulled out the ticket from the movie theater.
Right.
And they cut it, or, you know, they decided against doing it. And I'm just like, that would have made it so much more like what I expect from the Twilight Zone. And going forward, any episode they made after this, they probably would have been left in, I would think.
Right. Well, and what they said too is that they cut it because they felt the executives were already taking a chance on this concept in general, and the supernatural element being added in would put it over the top, and they'd be like, no, it's too unrealistic. And so they said that's why they cut it. So it's only one of like a handful, I want to say like 5 or 6 episodes that don't have some supernatural aspect to it. And it's funny that they, you know, it's like that was we got to get the pilot. We got to get enough people, conservative people who would otherwise dismiss this as fantasy, to buy into the concept in general.
I found the original Hollywood Reporter review. Basically, it was a positive review. This was, let's see here, October 2nd, 59, they basically said that it was short and suspenseful. And, you know, this was kind of like the green flag, I would think, that this episode really people did enjoy it and they wanted more. And that was the beginning of everything. And it just rolled like a snowball downhill from there, because Rod Serling sure didn't run out of ideas or friends that had great ideas. And we have got, how many episodes did we say of the Twilight Zone to go after this one?
I think it's a total of 156, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
I know there was one episode that was actually considered too controversial. They only officially released it for syndication in 2016. That's like, I think it's one of the last episodes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I don't know. I think it was released, you know, on media before that, but for syndications for play on TV, I think was kind of controversial because I think it was around. It was like racial concepts of kind of matching those things up. So I'm sure we'll get to it eventually in the 5th season.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Awesome. So anything you want to add about this particular episode of the Twilight Zone?
Yeah, I you know, it's funny. I fall back on this. It's real familiar. It's one I've made several attempts to watch all the episodes of the Twilight Zone, and I always want to start with the first one. And it stands out to me as kind of it really of its time. You know, there's certain elements of it that I'm like, oh yeah, that's going back to this that talking method, the weird speech patterns. A lot of the stuff that socially was more acceptable at that time. What we know now is like, you know, you're not going to do that.
Right.
And it's
life
funny
was definitely different in the era of the show.
Yeah, it's of its time. But even then, it was progressive for then, and so, you know, in the context of today, it may seem a little anachronistic, but I think when you look at the concept and the stories behind it, like we said at the beginning, Serling really was ahead of his time in trying to push some of these ideas of opening people's minds and thinking differently about things that otherwise people would hit at loggerheads about. How do you look at this a different way so that you can understand and have empathy and have some idea of someone else's perspective? And I just love that about the series in general.
Definitely an early progressive mind. Serling. I have a terrible memory, but I did, and that's one of the reasons I revisit the Twilight Zone so often. But I literally, when you asked me, the funny part is when you asked me about wanting to do a Twilight Zone podcast, I had literally just finished a rewatch of the entire series for maybe the third time in my life, because I used to have the tapes, you know, like and everything like that. So it was a bedtime thing. Like for us, I'd turn on the Twilight Zone when we hit the SAG. It was on the TV in the bedroom. I'd watch 1 or 2 episodes, and started, I think maybe during the pandemic, maybe. Yeah. And I just finished the very last episode right when we started talking about this. And it was so funny. And normally I think most people would be like, no, I just finished watching that all 5 seasons of that again for the third time in my life. But I was like, yeah, I'm in. And I think I credit part of it is I have this terrible memory. So for me, going back to it isn't like I remember every little detail. I only remember the big moments, you know, so it's still fresh. And I think that speaks to, I'm not trying to say it's not memorable material. It is, obviously. But it speaks to like the perennial kind of nature of it. You can come back to it over and over again and get something different out of it every time.
And picking up those little details of what, you know, you may have missed the last time, knowing how the end is and what the twist is and all that, you can look at and look for the clues, and it makes you appreciate the writing even more for that as well. It's interesting that looking at this, some of these people, I always like to see like who's still alive, you know, from old episodes and stuff like this.
We do that.
It looks like James Gregory, the guy who played the general, because I recognize his face, and I'm like, he's been in something, but he's one of those actors, and you say this on the NLTOP all the time of like the famous face. They've been in a ton of stuff. You'd know the face, but you can't necessarily place them to a specific thing. And he just passed away in May of 2024.
Wow.
So it's kind of it's wild.
Yeah. How does it say what his age was? Because he was mature in this.
Yeah, he died at 78, so he must have been super young.
He looked so much older in this. Well,
right?
In the 50s, everybody looked older, I think. It's true of the 80s too. Like I think just life in general, like we've started taking such better care of our skin. Is what it boils down to. It's
what does Andy say? They had everybody looked old in that time.
Everybody looked old then. Oh, I just want to tell you a quick one-off before we wrap up and talk about next time. Last night, Amy and I watched an infomercial for Club Med from the 80s with Jim Carrey and Alan Thicke in it. It's on Riff Tracks.
What?
Yeah, if you have a Riff Tracks Friends subscription, I love their stuff. It's like $5 or $6 a month, but you get access to like hundreds of things they've done. And the most recent thing they released was this, and it is bizarre. Talk about like the Twilight. This feels like a weird, like almost a Twilight Zone scenario when you watch it, because you're like, there's no way this really existed, and that this is what these are the people involved in the story they're telling in an infomercial. It's very strange. It's like that's why it's like
it's like those commercials from Japan where Harrison Ford and Arnold Schwarzenegger wouldn't do an ad in the U.S., but another country they'll do it.
The early desperation. But next week or whenever the next episode of the Twilight Zone Revisited, Zoned Out drops, it will be One for the Angels. which I really like, is a really sweet. This is kind of the beginning of the heartfelt Twilight Zone episodes. Which is really interesting about this series is he does basically 4 drastically different stories to open this series. So it is an anthology in the truest sense, that one for the Angels and Mr. Denton on Doomsday, and then the 16 millimeter Shrine. These 4 first episodes could not be more different, yet like thematically and vibe wise, they somehow just fit together. But I'm a big fan of this second episode because I always thought it was incredibly moving. Also, it has Murray Hamilton in it from Jaws as Mr. Death, so that's fun.
Totally. If you're a child of the 80s, you're going to recognize these faces.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening to our first episode of Zoned Out. I'm Freddy. Joe.
I'm Joe.
All right. We'll see you guys soon.